Our title this morning is The Process to Transfigure. The Process to Transfigure. And let us begin. In the Old Testament times, Enoch and Elijah were the two people who did not die but ascended to heaven alive. Enoch and Elijah. However, while the account of Enoch appears briefly in Genesis 5, verses 21 through 24, and Hebrews 11, verse 5, the account of Elijah is written more extensively in 1 Kings chapter 17 to 2 Kings chapter 2. There is a greater account of Elijah's ascension to heaven without dying than there is of Enoch's account. So then, knowing this account in the Bible and how it is expressed in detail, let us know what kind of process the Elijah prophet went through to transfigure, to go to heaven without tasting death. Because we know that the Bible made a greater account of his ascension, so we must learn about it. So at this time, by looking at the process of Elijah's transfiguration, let us learn about the path we should take to transfigure, go to heaven without dying, and gain eternal life. The process of Elijah's transfiguration is expressed in 5 locations in the Bible. First, the brook Cherith. And then, the second location, the home of the widow of Zarephath. The third location was Mount Carmel. The fourth location was Mount Horeb. And then finally, the fifth location where Elijah transfigured was the Jordan River. So today, we will talk about the first location in Elijah's process of transfiguration. We will talk about Brook Cherith first. So at Brook Cherith, this was the training process to allow the old and former self to die. And this is a training process for us as well. So the first process, in order for us to be able to transfigure, we must let our old self, our former self, die. The prophet Elijah was originally a Tishbite, and he lived in Gilead. And we know this from 1 Kings 17, verse 1. Now Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, surely there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." So through this verse, we see that Elijah was a Tishbite, and he was of the land of Gilead. So Gilead is a land east of the Jordan. and a Tishbite, is believed to be a person of the cities of Gilead. However, God caused a drought and commanded the prophet Elijah to go to the brook Cherith. So, in this way, Elijah was forced to leave Gilead and he was made to go to brook Cherith. Here, the word Cherith in Hebrew is kerit, and it stems from the word karat, which means to cut and to kill. So, this is what Cherith means, to cut, to kill. In other words, God sent Elijah to the brook Cherith to cut out all elements of sin that remained in Elijah. So, this is the first process in which we must undertake to transfigure all the greed, all the pride within us, all our old former selves. We must cut that out. We must allow it to be killed off from ourselves, just as the word karat means in Hebrew. So let us look at the training course, the training path at Brook Cherith. First, Elijah had to eat the food brought by the raven, which was considered an unclean animal. So in this way, this was his process of cutting out sin in him and all his old former thoughts. In 1 Kings 17:6, the Bible records, "And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he would drink from the brook." But in the Bible, it says that the raven was considered unclean. So ravens could never be offered as sacrifices to God. So Elijah knew, of course, that the raven was considered an unclean animal. But consider this. If Elijah disliked this idea of receiving food from an unclean animal, that he would not accept the food from the raven, then Elijah would have starved to death. So then what does Elijah's acceptance of the food from the raven mean for us today? It tells us that in order to accomplish God's will, we must be able to cooperate with those people, those things we are reluctant to work with or whom we dislike, but we must do it if this is God's will. Secondly, even if Elijah wanted to eat more food, he was able to understand that he was unable to. He could not. Elijah could only eat the bread and the meat that the raven brought him for breakfast and dinner. He was unable to find food for himself. It was a time of drought. So, in other words, even if he wanted to eat more, there was no other food brought to him. So only breakfast and dinner was given to him, but no lunch. So for lunch, he starved. This was the process Elijah needed to kill the greed in him, even concerning his greed for food. desiring to eat more or desiring to eat other types of food. This was impossible. So today, as we go towards eternal life and our hope for transfiguration, we must also train ourselves to let go of our greed. No matter how thirsty we are for material things, we can only stay at our brook Cherith. No matter how hungry we become, we can only eat what God allows us. And we can only eat this with the raven of life that God gives us to help us achieve what we need to achieve and what we need to have. So do not be discouraged by the difficulties and the hardships presented before you at this time. Don't keep stumbling over these things, whether it's financial difficulties or difficulties in your situations. Rather, thank God instead. Why? Because you will realize that you are going through a training process to cut away your old former self, especially our greed. Then, when we are able to do this, God will lead us to the last spiritual Jordan River in our lives, where God will grant us the blessings of eternal life and even the blessing of transfiguration, where we go to heaven without dying. Please believe this. Third, Elijah could not do anything on his own. The only thing that Elijah was able to do at the brook Cherith was simple. That was the only thing he could do, was drink the waters at the brook and wait for the raven to bring him food. That was the only thing that he could do at brook Cherith. But before this time, Elijah went to the castle of King Ahab and told him that from this time forward, there will be no rain. So Elijah proclaimed drought, famine in the land. So this once proud image of Elijah disappeared into a shadow where all he could do was go to the brook and hide and be fed by a raven. In this way, not being able to do what we desire is also our process of training in order to kill the former things in us that are not productive in God. So if God says, wait for the raven to bring you food, we must be able to also obey like Elijah. We must do what we don't want to do if it is God's will. And we cannot do what we want to do if that is God's will. So through this training process, we must persevere, endure, and go to our spiritual brook Cherith. So we will be able to pass through the first location of our training course. At this time, as we go through our first process of transfiguration, let us victoriously pass through the first location of our training at Brook Cherith. And this year, may we all make one step closer to our final destination of faith. I bless this upon you in the name of the Lord.